Dear Professor Favale, I already had the opportunity to tell you this by email when we scheduled this conversation, but I must say that bringing your book to Brazil was a joy for our publishing house, just as it is a joy to have you here for this conversation about the genesis of gender. And the fact that this book reached Brazil, I don't know if it's a surprise for you, but it's a proof of its relevance and of the seriousness with which it treats such a controversial subject, right? This book, however, is a bit personal too. All the discoveries you made, all the results you've reached are related to your own academic history. What exactly was the genesis of gender?
Yes, this book in many ways was a long time in the making. Yeah, so my academic background is in feminist theory and gender theory, and I became Catholic about 9 years ago. And so, since adopting a Catholic worldview, um, I now am interested in these same questions, but I approach them from a different path as a Catholic. So what I'm trying to do in my work is to help other Christians, other Catholics navigate the questions about gender in our time with the kind of insider knowledge that I've gained through my academic life. But I actually started to write a different book, and then it turned into this book. So I
Mhm.
started to write a book about Catholicism and feminism. But then the book on gender, or the chapter on gender, just kept growing. It kept getting bigger and bigger, and I realized, there's a lot to say about gender in our cultural moment. So then I reached out to the publisher and said, I think it's going in a different direction, and then it became the genesis of gender.
But when you talk about gender in this book, you use a not very common expressions. You say gender paradigm, which is not the same, I guess, as gender ideology or gender theory. Here in Brazil, we talk a lot about the teoria de gênero and gender theory.
Mm-hmm.
Paradigm sounds like something more normative, maybe. Why do you prefer paradigm instead of other expressions? And how does that change the way you look at this social, political, anthropological, philosophical problem?
Yes. So I chose to use the word paradigm for a couple of reasons. One was a more rhetorical reason because I wanted to write in a way where people who have different views on this would still want to read it, right? So I think, at least in an American context, gender ideology, as soon as you say gender ideology, people know the assumption is that you hate everything about it and you think it's terrible, right? So it's great for preaching to the choir. It's great for, talking to other people who agree with you. But I was hoping to reach people who might be put off by the phrase gender ideology. And then gender theory is a very academic term, right? And so I think what I wanted to do by paradigm is I wanted to highlight that a paradigm is basically a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing all of reality. It's an interpretive framework for not just gender, right, but reality, language, God, human beings, right? So what I wanted to highlight was that in our time, there's this paradigm, what I call the gender paradigm, which is a way of seeing that is in many ways at odds with the Christian way of seeing reality and God and language and the human person and sexual difference. And so I wanted to kind of portray these two ways of seeing the world and to show where they are in tension and in conflict, and then at times where perhaps they can align. Um, so I thought paradigm would be the best term for capturing that. I wanted to talk about a way of seeing, not just an idea, right? It's not just about ideas, because once you sort of adopt some of these concepts, you're ushered into this whole way of approaching reality. And so I wanted to capture that.
And there are several fields of knowledge that deal with the same reality, right? Uh, you had, as you said, an extensive academic career. What do you think is the best approach to deal with the origins and consequences of this relativization of gender? Is it really a multidisciplinary problem, and to what extent does this fact of a lot of this multidisciplinarity hinder or facilitate our way of dealing with what you classify as the gender paradigm?
I think it can hinder it, right? Because when we talk, I think one of the problems is that, at least in academia, you have these different streams of thought that tend to be very isolated from one another, right? So you have, say, evolutionary biology here, or neuroscience here. So you have the kind of scientific understanding of what sexual differentiation looks like in human beings, right? Just in terms of the facts, the data. And then you have the philosophical and the theological, right? So you have the philosophical, which is kind of drawing conclusions about meaning and significance. And then you have theological, which brings in the realm of the transcendent. But none of these fields typically talk to each other about this, right? And so gender theory, in the way I encountered it in particular, is a very siloed academic discipline, where it adopts the gender paradigm, and then it doesn't really engage with other traditions. It doesn't engage with other ways of seeing. So there's not a lot of exploration of its own assumptions about reality. There's not a lot of reflection about what's being taken for granted. But a lot of those things are just assumed and never examined. So I think that makes it difficult for it to grow as a discipline, I guess, or to be tested, to be improved. So I do think the fact that we tend to have these disciplines that don't really speak to each other, that's a problem. But I'm beginning to see more of a kind of cross-pollination between disciplines, I think, as we, in fact, I've just been reading a book that's not yet published that does exactly this in a way that I find very exciting. So I'm seeing these glimpses that there are scholars, maybe philosophers, right, who are trying to engage with the science, but also engage with these theories, but to really look at their premises and to say, okay, is this true, right? Is this compatible with this understanding of reality, right? To do that, to do that kind of level of analysis.
As someone who deals primarily with words, as a poet and as a writer, the question of language, the use of language, the manipulation of language is of particular interest to me. It seems to me that after this ideological relativization of the biological realities, of this identification between sex and gender, the second step for those who want to propagate this paradigm is to make language reflect the same relativization. Why do the proponents of the gender paradigm, why do they focus on language, and how do they do it?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, one of the features of the gender paradigm, and you see this in gender theory, is, I guess, the fundamental belief that all of reality is a construct of society, and primarily through language, right? So gender theory, especially in the mode of Judith Butler, who's probably the most prominent gender theorist and the one who's really shaped the discipline. For her, she's very explicit that there's no, like, any meaning or categorization or interpretation of what we think of as reality is ultimately something we project onto reality. It's a story. So through language, we create stories about the world, and then we project those onto the world, and then we infer that they're actually real. So she says this about sexual differentiation, right? So for her, that, there's this kind of classic distinction between sex and gender, where sex is biology, gender is kind of the social aspects. But for Butler, she says everything is gender, even sex. So even our tendency to categorize these particular creatures who have certain features into two sexes, that's a construct of language, right? So if that's where you're coming from, right, if that's your view of reality, that everything is a story, everything is a fiction, then being able to change what you see as an oppressive story means changing language, right? So that view of reality leads to a certain kind of political praxis, which is to change language in a way that ushers in the kind of reality that you see as a better one. And so I think that's one reason why there is so much attention to language when it comes to gender, right? And also because when you look at this concept of gender that has emerged in our time, it's not rooted in sex, right? It's not rooted in just biological reality. It really is a linguistic identity, right? So it has to be supported by words, and it requires the participation of everyone else in order for that kind of linguistic structure to hold, right? Because it's not being held by brute facts about the world, like reproduction and things like that, right? So it's a story that's being told that requires the active participation of other people in order for the story to keep going.
And why children? I mean, see, we've talked about language, but since Dr. John Money, which is famous here in Brazil too, children are directly implicated in this normalization of the gender paradigm. Uh, in your book, you talk a lot about how easy it is for children and young people to have access to hormones that block puberty and some other medications too. Why do the proponents of the gender paradigm, why they do not restrict their experience and proposals to the adult population? Do they perceive it as an experiment, by the way? Because there are a lot of consequences when applying so many hormones, medicines to children, of course.
Right. Well, I think there are a few reasons, and one is a pragmatic reason, and that is that when it comes to medical transition, the goal is to approximate the physical appearance of the other sex as closely as possible, right? You want to pass as a member of the other sex and to be read as a member of the other sex. And once a body goes through puberty, that becomes really hard. Mm-hmm. So if from just a technological vantage point, if you're able to rewrite what puberty does to the body, right, then you're able to better approximate that process of cross-sex appearance. But that means stopping puberty, right? That means an intervention early in childhood. So I think that's one of the reasons, because you have people who have adopted this way of thinking about gender, and they just kind of see the body as a blank slate, as it doesn't have its own meaning. It's almost this kind of, it's this something to be manipulated. And so if this is your goal, right, if your goal is to have the body look this way, then the best way to manipulate it is before the process of puberty. So I think that's one of the reasons. I also think that in our time, you have, I would say, kind of true believers who have really adopted a view of gender identity, that there is this almost this gendered soul within someone, or this kind of pre-social core of gender within a person that can be discerned almost as soon as a child becomes vulnerable. And it's fixed, it's immutable, and that everything should be adapted according to that gender identity. And so for those true believers, they think that, that's the most humane thing to do, right? They see it in very essentialist terms, which is sort of ironic because yes, gender theory is very anti-essentialist, right? But we have kind of a new essentialism that has emerged in our time, which I call gender identity theory. And gender identity theory holds that there is such a thing as like the transgender child, right? And so, and there's also this kind of medicalized paradigm associated with it. Like there's like a new, almost a new natural kind, which is the transgender child. And the way to care for the transgender child is this medical pathway, right? And so they see it as this, a matter of social justice and the most loving thing to do, right? So I think that's what they're coming from. So I think those are two of the reasons why children have become mixed into this. And I think one reason there's so much attention on children is because that's also a reason that a lot of people are pushing back. Because I think if it were just adults, you know, in Western society, a lot of people are like, oh, live and let live, you know, let adults do what they want, right? But when the reasoning extends to the child, that's when I think people begin to ask questions. And so that's where the controversy is really focused.
You are a mother of four, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All these new ideas, or not so new ideas about gender, they are present in schools, in children's TV programs, children's books. In practice, how do you conduct your children's education in this regard? How do you filter information, and how do you think both parents and schools should do it?
Mm. This is tricky.
It's
I will say I don't have all the answers for sure. And my oldest is 10. So I have a 10-year-old is my oldest, a 3-year-old is my youngest. So I still have young children. I don't yet have any adolescent children. So the kinds of things I'm doing right now are more age appropriate. And that's mainly what I'm hoping to do, honestly, is to delay their encounter with the gender paradigm as much as possible. I know it's inevitable that they will encounter it. But yes, I'm very, you know, I'm lucky in that I live in an area where there are wonderful Catholic schools that I know aren't going to be teaching this. And I pay attention, you know, I pay attention to what the school is teaching. And I pay attention to the books they're reading or what they're watching, right? So at this stage, I'm trying to, on the one hand, delay their encounter or their exposure to the gender paradigm as much as possible. I'm also trying to instill in them a very positive sense of their own embodiment. And I'm also trying to root their understanding of what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy in the body and not in things like toys or colors so much, right? And they observe, you know, that these are girl toys or pink, things like that. But I really try to talk about boys and girls in terms of the kinds of bodies we are. You know, or also things like a girl, you know, can grow up to become a mother and a boy can grow up to become a father. And as they get older and approach adolescence, my plan is to really help them have a conscious awareness of their own fertility, right? Because I think the more that we know about how our bodies are designed and the reasoning for like the purpose of the way our bodies are designed, the less possible the gender paradigm will seem, right? So I do think that I really want to give them good body literacy, age appropriate,
Reality wins,
as
right?
they grow. Yeah, exactly. So I really want my kids to develop an awareness of their own fertility and the kind of responsibility as well that gives us as fertile beings. But so that is one thing. I do think that it's, you know, it's important to, I do think a lot of young people encounter this gender paradigm by really being immersed on the internet. And I don't mean just kind of using the internet as a tool, but really almost living online. And I think the more immersed someone is in the digital world, the more the gender paradigm seems possible because there's something disembodied about the online world, right? You can create an avatar for yourself. You can become whoever you want online. You can present yourself as the opposite sex, right? So there's this fluidity in the realm of the internet that I I think you don't want to spend too much time there, right? So I think it is really important for parents as much as possible to keep their kids and their teens really rooted in the real world and in their bodies, and doing physical activity and having friends with people who they actually talk to face, right? Who aren't just these kind of, bodiless people that they chat with online.
Mhm.
So those are some of the ideas I have. Yeah.
I remember once hearing Camille Paglia, who is a renowned feminist, right, observing that the phenomena of gender confusion are characteristic of historical moments of civilizational decay. And indeed, it seems that the problems of the gender paradigm became more acute when the process of secularization became more acute too, when the consequent relativization of traditional values and categories became extreme. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Although I would also highlight consumerism, right? Because
Mhm.
if you think about, um, I don't know, pre-industrial societies, they had very like thick and robust understandings of gender, right? They had very well-developed gendered worlds. And there were ways of symbolically expressing the reality of gender through, and that were apparent everywhere, right? In the way that certain domains of work are structured or the way that people dress, right? So in our time, that has all really been flattened to now it's about consumerism, right? So the gender has become almost a style or an aesthetic that you kind of adopt or curate for yourself. And it's about something you buy. It's about something you wear. Okay. And it's something that I design for myself, right? We don't receive it from the community or the culture that we're a part of. So I think that's another, I think there are a lot of influencing forces that are feeding into this phenomenon, but one of them, yes, would be what you're talking about, like the secularization, kind of the decline of community and social structures that provided a thicker understanding of gender and a much more meaningful one, right? And one that's exterior to the self. But now it's all just about what I feel and what I can kind of curate or purchase for myself. Um, and it becomes like an outfit that you put on in a way, except it's more and more about adapting the body itself, right? Like this is, as a feminist, sometimes I think about the history of women's fashion and how, at certain times in history, you would have, like say in the Victorian era, you had these really like tight corsets that would actually do harm to the female body, trying to give this exaggerated form where the ribs would become constricted and the hips would be exaggerated by these like pillows.
Mhm.
Um, well, now we're doing the same thing, except now it's a changing the body itself. It's not through fashion. It's actually, it's through the scalpel. It's through surgeries. It's through, so it's the same idea in a way, but now it's really about individual self-expression. And then the technologies are much more invasive in terms of what they do to the body itself.
Is it possible to fix this confusion without reference to religion? I mean, or religion has an important part in the view of the roles and the nature of both male and female sexes, right? Um, what's the role of religion in in the process of healing this confusion that gender paradigm created?
Hmm. Yes, I think you can go part of the way with reason and with good science, right? Because again, there's just it's a feature of reality that human beings are sexually reproducing species. Sexual dimorphism is a fact that influences our lives in concrete ways. And so reason and a good look at that data, that just the facts on the ground about what sex means, can take you, I think, pretty far away from, or pretty far out of the gender paradigm, right? Because there's a sense in which it's really about a deeper encounter with the real, right? So realism, there's a certain kind of realism, a certain level of realism that can be found through reason and through science and logic. But then I think where religion comes in is in the question of meaning and significance, right? So given the fact that that human beings come in these two modes of being that are capable of bringing another human being into existence, well, what is the deeper signification of that? Like, what is the deeper spiritual meaning of that? And I think that's where, when we have more of a religious perspective and a sacramental perspective, then we can begin to see like the beauty, I think, and the greater significance that sexual difference plays as well. That it's not just about concrete reality, but also about the way that concrete reality points toward the realm of the supernatural, right? So in a sense, we need to re-encounter the realm of the natural. And then we also need the realm of the supernatural. And I think the gender paradigm rejects both.
I have this one last question. Despite the theoretical fallacies behind gender paradigms, we are dealing here with people, right? With lives, with souls, with families, with personal histories, hopes, pains. If we can and we should be rigorous with ideas, we should like fight them. Concrete people, they demand a different approach, of course, and this is something that we will have to deal with in all layers of society as a real problem. Transgender people. To what extent are we prepared for this as a society, as a Western society? And what, in your opinion, Abigail, is a convenient, is the best way to deal with this, with people, concrete people who suffer from gender problems or who are victims of the paradigm of gender?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you asked this question. I think in some ways this is the hardest question, the one that demands our deepest attention, I think, because it's, in a way, it's easier to do battle with ideas, right? It's easier to, even in a charitable way, but to really examine what a particular belief system is claiming and to critique it. But then there's the person, and that's what makes the gender paradigm so difficult to engage with, because we have to reject ideas that are false and that are harmful. But at the same time, the person who might have adopted the gender paradigm should not be rejected, right, in that same way. And so I think what's being asked of us in this moment is kind of a twofold response. One is a fidelity to the truth, but the other, I think, is a radical receptivity to the person in whatever state he or she is in. Because I do think that the gender paradigm tells a very compelling story. There's a reason why you're suffering. There's a reason why you don't feel at home in your body. There's a reason why your life isn't the way you want it to. And if you just fix this one thing, if you just fix your body, you'll become who you really are, right? That's like, who wouldn't want to believe that story, right? Because I think the desires that the gender paradigm promises to fulfill are deeply good and deeply human desires, right? The desire for community, the desire for integration and for wholeness, the desire for belonging, the desire to feel that our body is ourself, right? Those are all really good things. And so I think we have to be really receptive to the person who has those desires and who is experiencing pain in this area in their life. But that doesn't mean adopting the gender paradigm as well, right? So that's the tricky thing, is to welcome the person, but not to adopt that way of seeing, right? which is at odds with reality. But I think it's important to remember that people aren't ideologies, right? So I've talked to a lot of trans people in the course of my work, and every story is different, every experience is different, and so I think it's really important not to kind of think about transgender people as like these ideologues who are out there and this us versus them, they are the enemy. Like, no, of course not. We all struggle with a sense of disintegration in ourselves and tensions within our sense of self. And we all need integration and healing. And so I think it's really important to have a very compassionate and receptive response to people, even as we, have, I guess, a courageous response to these theories that are false.
Well, what can I say? That was a marvelous talk we had here, Professor Favale. I'm pretty sure our viewers will have a lot to think about. I'm already thinking here on your words, and I couldn't thank you enough for your time, for your availability, and thank you for your book.